Outlast 2 is an interesting case study in style. When is it too much? At what point does excessive style take away from the actual substance? You play as Blake Langerman, the husband of and producer to investigative journalist Lynn Langerman. The two of you are flying over rural Arizona doing a story on a 15-year-old pregnant woman found dead near a Native American reservation. Their helicopter crashes suddenly, but Blake survives and awakens to find Lynn's body missing, so he sets out to find her. As he does, he comes across the pilot, skinned and crucified, setting the tone for this environment he's traversing. Blake must navigate the wooded countryside and avoid the radical, manic, violent, and totally insane residents as they hunt him down, all while experiencing these haunting elementary school sequences. Before I start spoiling everything, let me just say that I did enjoy the game. For me, it's somewhere between a 6 and a 7 out of 10. There's some real value and challenge here for $30, but despite my personal feelings, there's some objectively negative aspects that really hold it back. One major flaw for both the gameplay and the story. So if you're interested in the premise and don't want to know these flaws going into it, consider yourself warned, because now we dive right in. The game is unique because while most games exhibit style in their atmospheres and aesthetics, Outlast 2 also exhibits style in its story. In keeping with the tense, horror-driven theme, nothing in the story is what it seems, and you should always be prepared for the unexpected. The game does an amazing job at environmental storytelling. Instead of long exchanges of expository dialogue or these 10-minute long, hands-off cutscenes, you can figure out a lot for yourself by just looking and listening around you. From the very first section in which you control your character, the haunting score and dark spectrum creates this intense feeling of anxiety and isolation. You can tell right away as a player that something is clearly wrong with this town and the people in it. You come across these deformed corpses and eerie dead baby dolls. You can hear painful screaming in the background. There's dried blood everywhere, including in a makeshift manger and on a cross. The atmosphere is perfect for a horror game. And yes, the game does have its fair share of jump scares. But Outlast 2 is at its best when you're moving through a dark, quiet area alone, with seemingly nothing and no one around you. Going off this, the school sequences are the biggest source of tension. There's something about being alone in this empty school at night, made more uncomfortable by the fact that nearly everyone experiences school during the day when it's crowded with students and teachers. It's made even more unsettling when you start seeing these gross apparitions and hear these sinister voices and laughter. I was always expecting something or someone to come out and kill me, or for something to go horribly wrong, which is good. That's what a good horror game should do. Put the player in a constant state of fear and anxiety. The game style rears its beautiful head during these cool supernatural sections, and the lush environments are almost always accompanied by the appropriate musical cue. Most of the music is chilling on its own merit, without the context of the setting and characters of the game. There's some unbelievable attention to detail. You swat flies when you come across a dead carcass. The water is some of the best in a game I've seen. The lighting effects are perfect. Stunning shadows and accent lighting accentuate each location. All the amazing aesthetics could easily distract the player from the fact that there's really not a whole lot in the way of gameplay. At its core, the gameplay of Outlast 2 is extremely basic. You advance through an area, try to avoid being spotted by enemies, ultimately do get spotted by enemies, then are faced with only two choices: run or hide. There are no weapons you can pick up and fight back with, which seems like a missed opportunity because there's always an assortment of farming tools lying around. Instead, you're either quick enough to hide in a barrel, closet, under a bed, or under the water, or you simply run away. The layout of each area is almost always open concept, but this is just an illusion, as the paths in which you're supposed to take to advance are very linear. If you know the right path, or are lucky enough to get it correctly, you're likely safe. If not, you're going to die over and over again. You very much learn from trial and error. Death is meaningless, except for insane mode, which I'll get into later. But considering the fact that you figure out the path by learning from your errors, the game has a terrible checkpoint system. Sometimes you will actually be spawned at the very beginning of a chase sequence, but you don't know where to go, right? That's why you died in the first place. So, how are you supposed to learn the right path when each respawn is at the very place you keep dying? It's in this way the level design is not always very good. The chase sequences are full of tension. The music gets frantic, and you often see the enemies behind you shining their flashlights, indicating that they're getting close. You can incorporate hiding with these chases, as you can turn around and engage the deadbolt on a door, buying you some time, or quickly hide under a bed while no one's looking. But despite the anxiety during chases, they begin to lose their luster when you realize this is pretty much the only thing you do. Blake is not a fighter, he's a journalist, and as such, he's equipped with a camera. The camera allows Blake to see in the dark with the night vision feature, listen in on the location of potential enemies using the microphone, and he can record certain objects and events which he will then comment on, giving you insight into the story from his perspective. Now, there is an emphasis on exploration, and you are handsomely rewarded with veering off the beaten path. You will have to heal yourself with bandages from time to time, which are scattered all around. You will have to find batteries for your camcorder to use your night vision during the sections of the game that are pitch black, of which there are many. There are documents scattered about that provide insight to what's going on with the story, as well as the recordings I mentioned, but these aren't exactly optional, which I'll get into a whole lot more in depth later. There are 5 difficulties in which you can play the game, which are all self-explanatory. I played through the game on Nightmare, which for all intents and purposes is the hardest difficulty. The game is a challenge. Enemies are fast, they spot you right away, sometimes a little too fast, and there's a shortage of bandages and batteries. But as far as bandages go, I found them to be pretty much useless on Nightmare. Most hits are one and done. There are some sections where you take falling damage, and so a bandage will be helpful, but if you're grabbed by an enemy, especially a boss type enemy like Marta or Nick and Laird, you're dead. The reason I say Nightmare is the hardest difficulty is because Insane is more of a mode than a difficulty. The AI is the same, although there are no checkpoints, you can't make manual saves, and death kicks you back to the main menu, ending your game, being more of its own mode than difficulty. It's like what Survival is to Fallout 4, more of its own mode than a difficulty. Insane is not for the faint of heart. You must practice each section several times on Nightmare and rehearse your actions to avoid death. Even though it was hard, I do feel like in a way this is how the game was meant to be played. Death in horror games is an interesting subject. There's so much more tension when you know you're playing with one life as opposed to death being meaningless and getting to retry repeatedly until you get it right. To conceal the fact that there's not much in the way of gameplay, the game makes heavy use of these environmental puzzles, but not really puzzles, more like interacting with objects that block you off from the section you're trying to reach, and you can't do so otherwise. They're really redundant and uninspired too. In fact, you could say they're fetch quests in disguise. Oh no, this elevator doesn't have power. Go find the generator and fire it up to advance. Oh no, you need to lift this gate so you can enter a crawl space, but you need to find a hook to attach to the chain so you can advance. You have to climb a fence, but you can't jump high enough, so you have to push a wagon up to it to give you a boost, all while you're being chased. Oh no, this crawl space is blocked off by a watermill, so you have to find a crank, then find the apparatus and attach the crank to it, stopping the mill, allowing you to crawl through. And that's really it. I've described all the gameplay to you. You really don't do anything else. This is the major flaw of the gameplay. I know you don't want this to be an action game where you can pick up a gun or a knife and fight back against every hostile in the game, but it appears the game would have benefited from adding another mechanic or at the very least something else for the player to do. But there's not, and so the rest of your experience is tied into the story. So like I said, Blake and Lynn Langerman are journalists covering the apparent murder of a 15-year-old pregnant woman known only as Jane Doe, found on an Indian reservation in rural Arizona. Lynn states there are high levels of mercury in her system, which gives rise to the theory she was living near or around an industrial facility. The story begins with Blake waking up from a dream about Jessica Gray, a friend of Blake and Lynn's from elementary school. Suddenly, a bright flash of light engulfs the sky, and their chopper goes down. With no explanation, you find yourself in an abandoned Catholic school, and you're given your first control of Blake. As you make the corner, you see an older man walking away into a dark room, but before you can reach him, the door slams shut, and when you turn around, this happens.
We're not alone here.
Now you're back in reality, and you come across the remains of the downed chopper, but with no bodies, so you set off to find Lynn. But before you leave the area, you find the pilot strung up on a tree, skinned and murdered. You then come across a town that's seemingly abandoned, which you later discover is called Temple Gate. But a little farther you see two mysterious men watching from afar. A little farther on you come across a tall woman wielding a modified pickaxe reciting some sort of scripture passage, whom you later find out is Marta, a lieutenant, so to speak, in the Testament of the New Ezekiel, led by Sullivan Noth. After escaping her and some other hostile residents, you are again engulfed in a bright flash of light, and you notice those same people chasing you have suddenly become manic and confused, like they just had a stroke or something. When you advance, you come across a chapel and overhear Noth's voice coming through a loudspeaker talking about the Antichrist and having to be like God to defeat it, but that God sent them a woman. The woman is Lynn, captured by this seemingly radical religious cult. When you exit the chapel, you find Lynn has escaped capture. She tells you her stomach hurts, and the two of you set out to reach safe ground. As you are leaving, you hear Noth state that Lynn is pregnant with the Antichrist, and that they plan on murdering her and her unborn child, which you both say is impossible. Before you get far, you are ambushed by more radicals, but these people are apparently different from the others. Instead of killing you and Lynn, they instead want the child to be born and given to God. As you're being held hostage, this psychotic, androgynous person named Val, who is overtly sexual, licking you up and down before leading with Lynn, but referring to her as mother and you as father. Val is the leader of these people called the Heretics, a splinter cell of the Testament of which they are in direct opposition. After evading some more enemies in another part of town, you are, for the third time, engulfed in a beam of light, but this one seemingly brings you back to the school from the beginning of the game. You reach a music room with an apparent suicide note written on the board signed by Jessica, who you can infer is Jessica Gray, whom Blake was dreaming about earlier. You pick up a picture on the desk of Jessica, Blake, and Lynn from their childhoods, and Blake comments that he's been transported back to the 4th grade when all this occurred. When you exit the room, you see the same man from earlier at the end of the hallway, but this time he sprints toward you before disappearing, and when you leave the school, you are again brought back to the present. When you awaken, you are greeted by a man named Ethan, but unlike everyone else in Templegate, he's not hostile. In fact, he offers to help. Ethan tells Blake he's been unborn, no longer faithful to the Testament, after they cast out, or scald, his wife, and after Noth raped and impregnated his 15-year-old daughter, Anna Lee. Noth demanded Ethan kill the unborn child, claiming it was the Antichrist, but Ethan spun a story that gave Anna Lee the chance to escape the cult safely. Blake realizes his daughter is Jane Doe, and when Ethan asks if she's alright, Blake says she's fine. So Ethan hides Blake in a hidden compartment to rest. While resting, Blake has the same dream about Jessica as before, and when he awakens, he hears Marta torturing Ethan to give up Blake, but when he doesn't, Marta murders him with her axe. So after evading some more enemies, including Marta, coming across yet another beam of light, and seeing Jessica's corpse hanging from a tree, you find yourself back in school and hear Jessica's screams before again finding her hanging. But this time she's snatched away by some unseen creature before you're brought back to the present, where you evade even more enemies, including Marta again, until you reach another chapel. Once inside, you see a man with his eyes gouged out and the word Judas carved into his chest, tied to a wagon wheel. The man begs Blake to put him out of his misery before Noth arrives with the man's wife. As you hide in the confessional, you overhear the conversation between Noth and the man, revealed to be Josiah, a member of the Heretics captured by Noth so that the Testament can find out where Val took Lynn. As they torture his wife Mary to obtain this information, Josiah reveals the Heretics are storing Lynn in the mines and keeping her safe until she gives birth to the child. So Blake goes out to find a path to the mines to save Lynn. Along the way, Blake comes across a house with an older woman who seems to be killing the infants of all the people of Templegate, so you can deduce that Noth has been having all the newborns killed for fear that one of them could be the Antichrist. After escaping more enemies and Marta again, Blake finds himself back at school being taunted by a mysterious voice, thanking him and saying he's been generous. Blake finds a game of hangman that Jessica left for Lynn to find, with the answer being unforgivable. As Blake goes through the halls, he is grabbed by a demonic figure resembling the one that snatched Jessica's body earlier. Back in Templegate, as Blake is crossing a bridge, he experiences an apparition of a swarm of locusts which knock him off the bridge and onto the ground below. As he hangs from a part of the bridge, he sees a gigantic man with a deformed dwarf perched on his shoulders hunt someone down with an inflamed arrow. As he moves along, he comes across a camp of extremely sick people, with sores all over their bodies, and bleeding and vomiting all over the place. These people are the Skald, cast out into exile by Noth because of their disease, which they themselves refer to as the sickness of the soul, believed to be the physical result of their sinfulness. After going through the camp and escaping the two men, named Nick and Laird respectively, Blake finds himself in a locker being hunted by the same mysterious man from the beginning of the game. An email on the headmaster's computer reveals one of the priests, Father Loudermilch, wants Jessica to stay at school instead of going on a class field trip, and that she has a miserable home life with her single father who neglects and maybe even abuses her. Blake experiences another apparition, then comes back to reality. As he crawls out into the open, he is apprehended by Nick, Laird, and other members of the Skald who claim he's the Skald Messiah, who must be crucified, killed, buried, and resurrected like Jesus, and then be eaten alive in order to heal the diseased and bring salvation to the camp. Following this theory, the Skald crucify Blake and leave him for dead, but he survives, and once he gets himself down and heals his injuries, he recovers his camera before being brought back to St. Sybil's. Back at school, Blake is again tormented by the demon, and after evading it, he answers a ringing phone with the same voice he had heard before, and the voice taunts him and insults him before he is again chased by the demon until he hides in Jessica's locker. Back in reality, Blake is again hunted by Nick and Laird, and despite escaping, he eventually gets caught in a trap and the Skalds bury him alive. Yet still, Blake survives. You notice a pattern here, and he makes his way toward the mines. He is hunted by the Skalds, who are ready to feast on him now that he's been resurrected. But Blake escapes, and as he does, Nick and Laird fall to their deaths going after him. After being hunted by the demon twice more and seeing Jessica's hanging corpse once again, Blake finds himself at a lake separating him from the mines. As he gets closer, he sees the same man from the school sequences start to walk into the water. Searching for a way to cross the lake, Blake notices a similar beam of light like the one he's been seeing, accompanied by the same sound effect, and in the distance he notices radio towers standing on top of an industrial-looking facility. He finds a raft and begins paddling across the lake, only to experience the burst of light again, this time being accompanied by dead fish, which Blake comments is a sign of the apocalypse. His raft gets capsized by a wave, and before he can swim back to it, the demon from school tries unsuccessfully pulling him to the bottom of the lake. Once he gets back on, he goes downstream and finally reaches the mine, but the raft breaks down and he's pulled into the water by the demon and finds himself back at St. Sybil's. So after being chased again, Blake comes to and starts entering the mines, where it is pouring down blood from the sky. He comes across a man, hysterical and covered in blood. He's from the Testament, and he tells Blake they tried getting Lynn back before she gave birth, but the heretics resisted and killed most of the ones Noth sent. Blake has another episode where he relives an IM conversation between himself and Jessica. After again seeing her hanging, you can see that Jessica was on an online support group for depressed and anxious Catholics, where it again hints that she's abused by her father. So after a few more stretches of being chased by both heretics and the demon, Blake finds Jessica's body bloodied at the bottom of a stairwell. He's chased by the demon, who taunts Blake in a bathroom as he sings a prayerful children's song.
So be careful, little hands, what you do. Oh, be careful, little mouth, what you say. Oh, be careful, little mouth, what you say. There's a father up above, and he's looking down in love. So be careful, little mouth, what you say.
It is during this part you can get your first close-up of the man you saw walking away at the beginning of the game. After another chase with the heretics, you finally reach an elevator that takes you down into the mines. At this point, it seems Blake has begun losing his sanity, as evidenced by his confusing Jessica for Lynn. This also becomes apparent as he sees the demon and hears the man's voice singing the same song from earlier, even though he's no longer in the school.
Father up above, and he's looking down in love. So be careful, little hands, what you do. Oh, be careful, little mouth, what you...
After navigating the mine, Blake is captured by the heretics and is confronted by Val, who seems pleased that Blake and Lynn's child will burn this world, and welcomes it into existence. Blake finally finds Lynn strung up on a cross while the heretics engage in a twisted orgy as they await the child's birth. Val pins Blake to the ground, which leads into a hallucination where Jessica was pinning Blake to the ground. It is during this scene you are given the most insight into Jessica's story. A young Blake and Jessica walk through the empty school and are stopped by Father Loudermilch, revealed to be the mysterious man you've seen throughout the game. Loudermilch tells Jessica to stay behind and for Blake to run home, which makes Jessica anxious and she begs Blake to stay. Just before he exits the school, Blake hears Jessica's screams, and upon going after her, finds her dead at the bottom of a staircase, with Loudermilch at the top, reminiscent of the earlier hallucination with the demon, implying that Loudermilch was the demon chasing you throughout the game. Once Blake snaps out of it, he awakens to see the Testament has infiltrated the mines, responding to the tip from Josiah earlier, and they slaughter all the heretics. Blake escapes the mine to find Lynn lying on the ground covered in blood, and he is stunned to see she actually is pregnant. It seems at this point a horrifying storm is happening, almost as if the world were coming to an end. So Blake and Lynn hurry to find shelter so Lynn can give birth. They find shelter but are confronted by Marta, who ambushes them and prepares her axe to kill Blake, when suddenly the storm rips off a metal rod from a roof which eviscerates Marta and kills her. Blake and Lynn take shelter in the same chapel that Josiah was murdered in, and Lynn gives birth, but as Blake holds their baby in his arms, Lynn says there's nothing there, and if you look, the baby doesn't cast a shadow. Lynn dies from childbirth, and Blake has another vision of him with Jessica. When he comes to, Noth is in the chapel and tells Blake that God has gone silent since the storm, and even though he killed all of his children like God told him to, he still isn't answered when he calls out to God. He then tells Blake to kill his child, claiming that if you love something, crush its skull under your heel. Then he slits his own throat. Blake leaves with his child to find all the residents of Temple Gate are dead, apparently by suicide, as there are bottles of cyanide all around. As he is about to leave, the storm intensifies, and Blake and his child are consumed by the sun. Blake finds himself back at school and hears Jessica's voice calling out to him. When he finds her, she says,
Don't worry. I'll never let you go. You never let me go.
Then you both kneel down to pray. Then it ends. Okay, so what the hell happened? Well, let me start with the inferences I made, which I feel are safe enough to be considered canon. Jessica had a crush on Blake, as evidenced by her playfulness and flirtatious attitude toward him, as well as the note that can be found in her locker, but Blake didn't seem to reciprocate. Jessica was being abused, likely sexually so, by Father Loudermilch. The agonizing screams, as well as her body language during the climactic cutscene, shows she feels extremely uncomfortable in his presence. That's why she begs Blake to stay with her, but instead, he leaves. Jessica ran from Loudermilch, who cornered her and pushed her down the stairs to her death, which was then framed as a suicide by hanging, as there are no rope marks on her neck when Blake finds her. Blake feels extreme guilt for having left her alone with Loudermilch, and he's being haunted by her memory throughout the game. As such, the demon chasing him in the school is a physical manifestation of Loudermilch, not only evidenced by the shot-for-shot scene where the demon is standing at the top of the staircase with a dead Jessica below, but if you're ever caught by the demon, you can see it has the same birthmark around the eye as Loudermilch. Now the question is, was the final scene real or not? In fact, you could ask that for pretty much the whole game, but we'll get there in a minute. It would seem as though Jessica is already dead, and that's why she tells Blake she'll never let him go, as in she will always be a part of him for the rest of his life, which is why he's haunted by her memory. The scenes with a living Jessica are likely flashbacks, but while it's possible the final scene is also a flashback, it doesn't seem to fit with the rest of the narrative. Now there's an interesting Easter egg in which the final scene of the game can either have a dead, corpse-like Jessica greet Blake, or a normal-looking one. At first I couldn't figure out what decisions triggered each particular ending, but it looks like it depends on whether or not you immediately turn around and start running toward Jessica when you hear her screams. If you dawdle or aren't quick enough, Jessica will be a corpse at the end, and vice versa. But this doesn't really do much in the way of closure, as like I said, she's dead either way, existing now only in Blake's mind. Now, as far as the Lynn storyline goes, it's difficult to examine it without the documents and recordings, as I alluded to earlier. The obvious question that's left undoubtedly unanswered is what happened to Blake? Did he die? Is he alive? You could come up with tons of theories, but there's no way of verifying any of them. What about the baby? Lynn says there's nothing there, as Blake supposedly holds the child in his arms, as evidenced by the lack of a shadow. But then, why does Blake act as though the baby is real? And Noth, too, he clearly comments on the child. And how is Lynn pregnant? She's clearly not at any point in the game except for the final scenes. And we all know pregnancy takes approximately 9 months, not 9 hours. And why is everyone in Temple Gate insane and trying to kill you? And what are those bright flashes of light, and why do they seemingly lead to these extremely bizarre apparitions and personality changes? And why was Blake seeing and hearing Loudermilk in the real world toward the end of the game? Better yet, how is he drifting in and out of these school sequences as if they were real so casually? Why did he confuse Jessica for Lynn? Why was it raining blood? Why was the apocalypse happening at the end of the game? Why did everyone kill themselves like the Jonestown Massacre? Why? Do you get the point? All these questions posed during the game were left unanswered by the end. Now, I don't know what's worse, the fact that a game can leave you with this many questions unresolved, or the fact that the game does answer these questions, but only if you found one document during exploration. Yeah, you heard that right. This is the second major flaw I alluded to at the beginning. Understanding the story relies on you finding one completely optional collectible, totally off the beaten path. During Lamentations, the chapter with the lake, if you, for some reason, swam into the lake, which Blake specifically says not to do because Loudermilk is in there, and he does kill you if you're in it too long, hugged the left side of the cliff, made your way onto this little island, turned on your night vision to see this piece of paper in the dark, picked it up and read it, you would be clued into a huge part of the story. The document is titled Old Traveler, and I did not find it during any of my first 3 playthroughs of the game. Apparently, those mysterious radio towers have been emitting brainwashing microwaves that have caused everyone in Templegate to become absolutely insane. The mass capitulation mentioned could explain how Noth, and Val too for that matter, was able to exert control over the townspeople the way he did, while the self-inflicting discomfort goes to show their mutilating and destructive behavior. Now, I was left further in the dark because I didn't play the first Outlast, and while this game isn't a direct sequel, it is set in the same universe, and this document is the bridge over the gap. The company responsible for the events in Outlast is the Murkoff Corporation. Jenny Rowland, mentioned in the document, is Jennifer Rowland, a character from the first game who worked for Murkoff, who performed similar tests which resulted in similar results as this game. The fact that you see the flash of light coming from the towers during the lake section shows that this is where the Murkoff facility was located, which validates Lynn's comment in the beginning about Jane Doe having mercury in her blood because of living near heavy industry. The school recordings, although garbled and incoherent, flashed the Murkoff logo sporadically. The towers emitted the flashes of light throughout the game, with each one taking its toll on the people who were exposed to them, which led them to become violent, fanatical psychopaths. Blake himself began to suffer from the radio waves as evidenced by his recurring visions of Jessica and Loudermilk, and each one became increasingly intense and violent. As he gets closer to the towers, which is indicated by reaching the mines, his hallucinations become extreme, the raining blood, being sucked in the water by Loudermilk, confusing Jessica for Lynn. By the end of the game, Blake was insane as well, hallucinating the baby, and Noth was able to see it because he too was insane. There's another document from one of Noth's disciples where they mention getting close to the towers but being overcome with waking dreams and visions of flames and insects. And aside from some of those visions appearing as sex organs, there were others still the person was embarrassed to talk about, presumably graphic sexual content. All of this seems to explain the lustful and deviant behavior by some of the townspeople, specifically Val and her heretics. When Noth says that God has gone silent since the storm, it's likely that the storm at the end of the game damaged the radio towers, which has happened before according to the document, and since the signal was gone, the voices in his head went with it. Now, there are still 2 big questions that aren't answered with this information. Was the storm even real? And if Blake hallucinated the baby, why was Lynn still pregnant? The storm would appear to be real since it accounts for the signal freeing Noth from his brainwashing, and because the storm is directly responsible for Marta's death. But what was up with the ending? The sun engulfed the entire world? So, did the world actually end? But then, how was Blake able to have the final vision of Jessica? Or was the storm symbolic of Blake's total loss of his mind due to the towers? And as far as Lynn's pregnancy, forget the fact that Blake lost his mind. Lynn still believed herself to be pregnant despite the fact there was no baby. And I wonder, Lynn spent almost the entire game underground in the mine. So would that have made a difference in her being affected by the towers? Because if she had lost her mind too, wouldn't she have also hallucinated the baby? But then again, Val and the heretics were also underground, and they're all clearly batshit crazy. And if this radio tower wave idea is true, where does Ethan fit into all this? He seemed to be completely sane and coherent, but he himself said he lived in Templegate, so shouldn't he be gone like everyone else? Do you see how every time we answer a question, we pose another one in its place? There are other documents that reveal Noth has syphilis and gonorrhea, and has been transmitting them both to the people of Templegate. These documents talk of a man who sells Noth penicillin, and this grape aid, presumably something similar for the Scald, who in fact are not suffering from a sickness of the soul, but syphilis and gonorrhea. 2 documents specifically mention these diseases by the townspeople, so Noth has been lying to them this whole time, casting them out into the Scald when he's the one responsible for their illnesses. The game tries its best to be ambiguous and open-ended, and I understand the premise. Ambiguity can be a good plot device. It's up to the viewer to make their own interpretations about what happened, and it makes you feel like you're in the driver's seat. You're not just passively letting the story wash over you. You're actually driving the story, in a way. Inception probably does this the best. The totem starts to stop suddenly, but the movie ends before the big reveal, so it's up to you. Did Cobb finally redeem himself and get reunited with his kids, or was it all just a dream? The reason it works so well is because the plot has posed a fill-in-the-blank question, but given you 2 choices from which you can pick. Outlast 2's problem is that there are multiple unanswered questions, and they don't give you the multiple choice selections for any of them. In other words, any theory you come up with concerning the story could be right. It could be wrong. The point is, there's no way to prove whatever theory you come up with. There are some other questionable plot points too, like why do Nick and Laird try to kill you during gameplay, but in the 2 cutscenes when you're caught, they instead nail you to a cross and bury you alive. I understand that they think Blake is the Scald Messiah and that they must treat him like Jesus Christ to receive salvation, but then why when they catch you during gameplay, Laird shoots an arrow between your eyes? That's completely contrary to their gospel. Same thing with Val. When you're caught by Val during chases, you die, but during cutscenes, Val expresses lust and the desire to share love with the Father. Now, the in-game recordings do provide some clarity to the rest of the story. Blake's comments about each one begin to sound cryptic and nonsensical as the game goes on. Vague comments like,
"He said she did it to herself. He said he was protecting you."
which has nothing to do with the subject being recorded. And
"Going to heaven. God, before they killed the children, you should have loved me. What am I doing?"
the comments are most likely about Jessica. The he is Slaughtermilch, who lied to Blake about her death being a suicide, and Jessica is obviously telling Blake that he should have loved her, and maybe she'd still be alive. The part with the fence,
"Pieces of my skin stuck in the barbs. It was too late to hold her up. And I was just a kid.
was about him finding Jessica's body at the bottom of the stairs. This is apparent when he sees the hanged man and immediately confuses him for Jessica. The raining blood is symbolic of Jessica's blood when she died. This all gives rise to the idea that Blake has lost his mind, and that reality and fantasy have become one at this point. The final recordings provide the most insight as to what's happening, at least regarding Blake's mental state and his guilt over Jessica. As he's going through the storm with Lynn, Blake says,
"We're out. I got Jessica out. It was cold, but the snow had just started. We'll find a grown-up and we'll tell them what happened. We'll be okay. It's not my fault."
So he's not even in touch with reality anymore, as he's still caught up with not saving Jessica when he had the chance. So he's hallucinating staying with her instead of leaving her with Loudermilch and exiting the school into the snow. He also says twice more that he was just a kid, and it wasn't his fault, referring to her death. And in the final recording, Blake says he will raise his child as if it were Jessica, and that in this way she'll get to live out her life the way she was meant to. Now this could explain why Blake has hallucinated the child. His guilt has manifested physically, and he sees the chance to save Jessica and give her the life she didn't have as redemption for her death. But then again, this is wasted when you consider the fact that Lynn's pregnancy was impossible, so we're right back to square one. The problem here is that, as I've shown you, the player is left to wander about much of the story without the finding of the collectibles. Now, I'm all for rewarding exploration, as it's something I always devote a ton of time toward when playing. But the game takes this concept to an extreme. It's not optional, it's necessary to find nearly all of them, otherwise you're left in the dark. It's a shame because, like I said, the game excels at environmental storytelling, so the collectibles should only have to supplement the narrative, not explain it. And it's especially concerning because some of these documents are so far out of the way of the very linear path you're meant to travel, and some of the recordings are of objects and events you otherwise would never think to record. Now, one final thing is that the recordings during the school sequences are incoherent, unless you play them backwards. You can't do it in the game, but if you put them in the editing software, you can hear Loudermilch's voice. They're mostly unimportant to the story, as they're mostly just him reciting scripture, but again, why not include some way to listen to them in the game? I doubt that most players would know to play them backwards, or even have the means to do so. But then again, I guess that's what YouTube is for nowadays.
Dear Lord, sweet Jesus, forgive my sins and accept my gratitude. Thank you, God, for killing the child.
There's so much intrigue and potential in the story. There's so much tension and anxiety in the atmosphere. The attention to detail, the stunning visuals, the amazing music, everything is polished to an insane degree. Yet I can't help but feel that Outlast 2 does not equal the sum of its parts. The shortcomings in the gameplay, the completely ambiguous and open-ended conclusion, the reliance of finding documents and recordings to understand the narrative, it leaves me wanting so much more game, but not in a good way. Not in the sense of, man, this game needs to be just an hour or two longer because I'm having so much fun. But instead, man, this game needs to be at least an hour or two longer because I have no idea what's going on. But still, I enjoyed it. And it's without question a technical spectacle, especially when you consider it's an indie game priced at $30. If we do get the obligatory Outlast 3, I hope Red Barrels will improve upon their storytelling while keeping the terrific set pieces and aesthetics. Nevertheless, Outlast 2 is a game that warrants a place in your collection. A game that's liberal in its application of style, even if it's at the expense of the substance.
Now the light has gone away. Savior, listen while I pray, begging thee to watch and keep, and send me quietly to sleep. Watchful Savior, wash away all I've been wrong today. Help me every day to be gentle, gentle, more like thee.